Not long ago, in her book called The Monarchy of Fear, the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum discussed the hostility towards women expressed by President Trump and his supporters. She attributed it mainly to their fear of women, and she suggested there were three main sources of that fear. First, there was an anxiety that women are no longer happy being silent, selfless homemakers. Secondly, she said, there's a dread of women's sexuality. And thirdly, there's a worry that women are taking the jobs that some men felt are rightfully theirs. And I agree with Nussbaum that these three sources of fear are all very important aspects of 21st century misogyny. But in this paper, I'd like to focus on another sort of fear, which is a more unconscious fear, a fear of women that I think in many cases is rooted in early development. And what I'm going to suggest is that this unconscious fear is at the heart of the misogynist's destructive hatred of women, and also at the heart of his fantasies of omnipotence, through which he then shields himself from his fear and anxieties. But before I explore this unconscious underpinning of misogynist fantasies, I'd like to take a closer look at what misogyny is. So the dictionary defines it as a hatred of women. In other words, it's an emotion, it's a feeling of hatred, the object of which is women. But not everyone who hates women is necessarily conscious of their hatred. On the contrary, they may work very hard to defend themselves against that feeling. For example, by denying or disavowing the hatred. So for instance, the misogynist might loudly proclaim, not only to others, but to themselves too, how deeply they love and care for women. But in some cases, their actions belie their proclamations. So one of the most obvious examples of misogynist enactment is domestic abuse. The World Health Organization estimates that some 641 million women around the world have been subjected to physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. Just a few examples. In one case, a 22-year-old woman in Nigeria was punished by her husband for attending a relative's marriage ceremony without his permission. What he did was he hacked off her right hand with a machete. In Britain, a woman started dating a man who, after an argument, tried to strangle her, and that was just the beginning. What she said is, he pushed me over in the kitchen, he punched me between the legs, he smashed a saucepan in my face, and I was so bruised I couldn't leave the house. I didn't tell anyone because he said he'd kill me if I did. He tried to keep me away from my family because he told me they were no good. I didn't speak to my parents for 5 years. My mind wasn't my own anymore. One last example, in the US, a woman talked about having fallen in love with a man who similarly turned violent. She says, from that moment, my life was turned upside down. I was mentally, emotionally, and sexually abused. He degraded me. He talked about me being overweight. He stripped me of all my power. I thought of committing suicide many times. He isolated me from my support system. So accounts like these highlight the fact that often domestic abuse isn't only about physical and sexual violence, as awful as those are. It's also about exerting control over women, their bodies, but also their minds, their feelings, their lives. And in fact, what's become known as coercive control is now recognized by the Council of Europe as a form of abuse. We know from experience or from the newspapers that misogyny is also enacted in many workplaces.